So, everyone, I'm a PGY3 in psychiatry at Yale, coming off a stretch of call. Explains my long face, but I'm really excited to be returning to the UCLA Center for Social Medicine to be with you all today. My dissertation project and also my passion for social medicine and psychiatry were born in the intellectually and politically fertile grounds of the center, and my relationships with many of the people who visited and made the center what it is. So all to say, my time with you remains very much alive with me, and I think of you and many others. I'm not sure who exactly is there, but including people not presenting today with tremendous gratitude. Thank you all for the work in making such a vital place in a field where curiosity, anti-normativity, pluralism, and theoretical rigor are not always welcome. May we all return for a 30th year symposium, and may that be a time where social medicine is flourishing. Um, so the process of placemaking is not coincidentally at the center of my dissertation project, the outline of which I wanted to talk briefly about today. My dissertation examines the role of psychiatry in the carceral state through over 3 years of ethnographic research in the LA County jails. It emerged from two interconnected projects, one undertaken by community organizers and the other by a group of incarcerated men. I stumbled upon both projects within a couple years of first arriving to LA, thinking that I would be studying healthcare at the Rikers Island jail complex across the country. So in the fall of 2017, I met organizer, acupuncturist, and now friend Mark Anthony Clayton Johnson, who's there on the slide, after a lecture he gave at UCLA to this Center for Social Medicine. During that lecture, Mark Anthony presented a graph from the county's most recent consultant-produced jail plan from 2015, which forecasted a steady, uninterrupted increase of people diagnosed with mental illness from an average of a daily total of 3,000 in 2015 to 7,000 by 2035 in the LA jail system, which was already the largest in the US. So you can see the forecast from that report on the slide as well. The solution the consultants had proposed for such an expectation was a, quote, central consolidated treatment facility with around 4,600 new jail beds. The consultant report was the latest of the county's reports, they actually had three over 3 years, regarding its plan to replace its existing men's central jail. The condition of that jail and its other jails had already been found repeatedly to be in violation of the basic constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The county's pivot to the consultant's plans and its health rationale for building a new jail disturbed Clayton Johnson. Worse, many jail clinicians he encountered expressed support for the plan. He could not wrap his head around this realignment around health nor let it go. And it was an intellectual and political irritation he and I shared. My decision to pause my medical training to pursue a PhD in anthropology had been inspired in large part by the contradiction that prisoners had been afforded the legal right to healthcare just as the U.S. experienced a world historical expansion in jails and prisons. To defeat the county, Clayton Johnson had wanted to organize a different coalition of health providers oriented against the jail plan and towards making places other than jails, which he eventually succeeded in doing so. The coalition succeeded in doing so in 2019. This counter project took organizing. It also took understanding how and why the answer to the mental health crisis in jails was, for many providers and experts, more jails. So a year later, I visited the jails on a tour where I met Cragen Armstrong, who is pictured on the left and the right in the two photos. Cragen, along with Adrian Berumen, who's on the right, worked as jail merit masters at the time that I met them, a role that jail made wherein incarcerated people allot, quote, merit, such as food or phone time to well-behaving peers in exchange for extra privileges themselves. This unpaid job helped maintain order, saving deputies time and trouble. Unlike other merit masters, Cragen and Adrian had been placed on the jail's mental health step-down unit. Uh, However, they soon realized their training as merit masters was inadequate for what their peers required of them, many of who cycled in and out of the jail, psychically and physically deteriorating along the way. As they undertook this work, Cragen and Adrian confronted their own fragility and vulnerability to mental distress and breakdown produced by, although not entirely reducible to their captivity. Against this isolation and abandonment, they organized, developing the Mental Health Assistant Program. Over the next few years, I started visiting them inside the jails weekly with my colleague Philippe, who you may know. And during this time, they were asking themselves and us, what does the jail mental health service do? And why do their peers keep coming back to jail? In both cases, a community organizer outside and incarcerated men organizing inside, the goal was to plan and build a future different from perpetual crisis. To do so, both confronted the question, what is the role and function of mental health care as a logic and practice in the ever shape-shifting carceral state? How and why did mental health care appear to only sustain cycles of immiseration and destruction? In my dissertation, I consider what both groups were up against in seeking a different role for mental health care. I show how the LA jail mental health crisis question is fundamentally a question about the carceral state's ability to reproduce itself, institutionally and extra-institutionally. The terms of and purported solution to the perpetual crisis depend on the ideologies, institutional practices, and purported solution to the perpetual crisis. Uh, sorry, uh, the terms of the purported solution to the perpetual crisis depend on the ideologies, institutional practice, and knowledges, and wider political economic relationships in which jails have become commonsensical and enduring public institutions. To do so, jails have emerged from wider regimes of the body and mind, labor regulation and discipline, public space and capital. They've also been produced by, while also producing broader regimes of meaning and regulation of gender, race, class, and ability. The jail mental health crisis also emerges from particular ideologies around madness, sanism, responsibility, and psychiatric knowledge and intervention, as well as a political economy of mental health care defined by privatization, fragmentation, and individual responsibility. The narrative of how the LA mental health system has arrived at this current state remain contested, yet few argue against its dysfunction epitomized most dramatically in its jail system. These jails are frequently held up, in fact, as a symbol of the national nightmare of the US mental health system. We might also imagine how this jail mental health crisis also represents a moment within the longer history of psychiatry, which has experienced cyclical episodes of what scholar Sasha Warren has called the quote, fever dream of restless utopians, counterbalanced by periods of paralyzing despair. Few images have represented that utopianism than the mythic moments of psychiatrists breaking the asylum's chains physically and mentally restraining the mad. Within such a narrative, the LA's jail mental health units defined by isolation and restraint may be better considered a psychiatric dystopia, a here and now that presumably should have been impossible were psychiatry the liberator that it has sometimes hoped and imagined itself to be. It is important to situate the current conjuncture of the LA jail mental health crisis into these longer histories of neoliberalism, the US carceral state, the political economy and mental health care, and the history of psychiatry. But I also tried to venture an answer to the question posed by Mark Anthony, Cragen, and Adrian inside and outside the jail. So my main argument for my dissertation is that the LA jail system has recruited psychiatry to enact a discursive technospatial fix to the problem that madness and psychic decompensation generally introduce into the jail's institutional order. By fix here, I do not mean a literal solution. Instead, I'm drawing on the concept of a spatial fix as articulated by geographer David Harvey. Harvey describes how capitalism has repeatedly sought to resolve crises of surplus through geographic expansion in its search for profit. This expansion displaces, without resolving, capitalism's inherent tendency towards crisis through the production of new infrastructures. For Harvey, a fix is akin to a drug user's use of a drug as a desired but temporary solution that does not resolve an underlying problem but may actually create new ones. Ruth Gilmore, of course, productively extended this concept to understand how California's prison building project of the 1980s represented one such spatial fix. Confronting surpluses of land, labor, finance, and state capacity, California officials displaced these distinct but interrelated political and economic crises onto prisons, treating them as, quote, catch-all solutions. This new carceral infrastructure in turn temporarily secured the wider system, but also established the conditions for still newer crises. Carceral mental health care, I suggest, is one such crisis. A carceral psychiatric fix likewise displaces, without resolving the problem of incarcerating madness, from the carceral institution and neoliberal carceral social order onto the person's individual pathology and or brain, into its mental health housing units, or out to mental health diversion programs and or state hospitals. This displacement enables the reproduction of the criminal legal system in the jail while also leaving unaddressed the precipitants of the crisis. Enacting this fix, however, requires a particular form of psychiatry, one explicit in its biological orientation and implicit in its anti-humanist therapeutic pessimism, where patients' lives are doomed to recurrent incarcerations and early death due to their inner pathology, and in which care is alienated and mortified. By rendering madness primarily internal to captive inmates, the jail and its mental health services obscure how madness is simultaneously internally and institutionally constituted. That is, the self-destructive acts of captive inmates, such as feces smearing, flooding cells, self-injury, and suicide, are all only made to appear as behaviors of the sickest of the sick, rather than also as behaviors elicited by institutional processes and historical circumstance. How these behaviors become repeated and predictable rather than exceptional features of the jail, I argue, is through a regime of custodial control and care enacted via a balance of ready neglect and reluctant attention. This regime is also notably a spatial and labor regime. How much and what kind of attention is given is shaped by the presence of deputies and the relative absence of clinicians. Jail mental health care in this setting only euphemizes and launders the jail's everyday practices of domination and alienation. It was Cragen and Adrian and the mental health assistant program that they built over the years of my fieldwork who demonstrated to me the jail's dependence on this form of psychiatry, answering their own question from years earlier. But external pressure on the jail, so external pressure on the jail afforded new internal pressure and opportunities for the jail to improve its mental health care. Cragen and Adrian seized this opportunity and this opening. On their unit, they worked with clinicians and deputies to resist the impulse towards displacement via restraint and isolation of disruptive captive inmates. Instead, through an ethos of refusal, curiosity, and mutuality, and non-punitiveness, they worked with their mad peers to develop trusting relationships. In so doing, they dramatically reduced acts of self-harm and psychic decompensation, and ensured the majority were restored to their mobility through the unit. They also transformed assumptions about them, all of whom had been considered by the courts to be irredeemable. Through their labor and imaginations, the the mental health assistants broke some of the chains ideologically and materially in which they and their peers had been oppressed. They did so by making a place in a setting whose only places were fungible cells and units gradated by level of restraint. In making a place, they transformed themselves and their relationships with one another, an act of what Fanon might have called disalienation, and what Gilmore might have referred to as an everyday prefigurative practice of life in rehearsal. They also took the practice of jail psychiatry to its limits, a form of utopian practice that otherwise strangled by carceral institutions. This act of disalienation is partial, contradictory, subject to parasitical co-optation by the jail, and its successes have also rendered clear some of its limitations. Nonetheless, their exceptional unit clarifies the norm of the psychiatric fix and psychiatry's complicity to the jail's practice of domination and alienation. It also renders clear the therapeutic pessimism that underwrites the jail's dystopic practices. Cragen and Adrian's utopian experiment, in other words, recalls psychiatry's liberatory potential, not through its technical interventions alone, but also through working with the very people considered most irredeemable and hopeless, and to help make them, as Fanon would have put it in his affirmative vision, quote, no longer foreign to their environment. Okay, so with the very last few minutes, a bit more about this remarkable project of disalienation. So the complete history of how Cragen and Adrian, along with Sarah Tong, a psychiatric technician, transformed the step-down unit into a place where their peers were supported and celebrated as a long and complicated story. It has been partially told by Cragen and Adrian themselves in their book, The Solution: Mental Health Assistance Bridging the Gap to Effective Treatment, for which there is no substitute. But for now, just a bit of elaboration of the history. So, from our early meetings in 2018 to my last visit to the unit in 2022, Craig and Adrian and other of the mental health assistants developed the experimental structure of the step-down unit. They did so by repeatedly appealing to the logic of mental health care and the betterment of their peers. They also backed up their experiment with results. They decreased self-directed violence and suicides, episodes of agitation, and conflicts between captive inmates. When it was studied in 2019, it was in fact found to have a 600% lower rate of self-directed violence than other comparable jail units. Along the way, the mental health assistants restructured the unit in a counter-hegemonic fashion along several interrelated lines of practice, meaning, and authority to change the expectations for themselves, their peers, and the unit. They restructure the everyday activity of the unit's use of language in interpersonal relationships, the standard of care, and also the overarching ideas and attitudes. Much of the focus, thus, of the program was on intervening into the jail's practices that could negatively affect their peers' well-being. It's depersonalizing and dehumanizing architecture. It's accrued dirtiness. It's acceptance of individual self-neglect. It's forced and encouraged isolation and idleness. It's minimal and poor-tasting food. It's relations of antagonism and fear. And it's disregard for individual self-understanding and future. Behaviors like flooding and feces smearing were not accepted as a personal affair or biological inevitability, but one produced, at least in part, by the institution, and that could be prevented by institutional action. The difference between the MHAs, and here's the graph of the self-directed violence in the jail. The difference between their unit and the rest of the jail has led to it frequently being referred to as, quote, Disneyland. This designation was alternatively noted with derision by deputies and enthusiasm by some of its external advocates. For the deputies, Disneyland appeared to capture the preposterous, particle, and unreal character of a unit not defined by discipline, and wherein captive inmates were treated as other than criminals. Some of its advocates, on the other hand, celebrated the unit for many of these same reasons. Its colorful and adorned exterior rendered it an image for the, quote, therapeutic jail of the future. The unit's glossy appearance, however, hides its complicated and contested history I just gestured towards, in which the unit emerged in spite of and not because of the jail and its mental health service, in which the unit emerged in spite of, not because of the jail and its mental health service, and owed its existence due to the labors and imaginations of captive inmates themselves and the mental health service lowest paid worker, the psychiatric technician. And its significance, I believe, resides exactly in the dual interpretation it promotes. For the jail unit to become therapeutic, in other words, it had to undo much of what made it a jail, which includes its jail mental health service. So in this regard, the MHAs and their success represent a shining example of something us students and practitioners of social medicine know well, which is that thinking the biological, the psychic, and the social together introduces new possibility, even when and where it is hardest to find. And then just one very last note, I added this, so there's a website that we created for the mental health assistants, which I would love for you all to check out. And then right now is a particular time to be speaking about Cragen and the mental health assistant program, because Cragen is going through the courts. His case is being revisited. It has been, I've only heard about it from afar, come across the country from Philippe and other advocates. But I know his mother, who is a big part of the story, would very much appreciate any support anyone would be willing to offer for him and them. So with that, I'll end there.
Questions for Jeremy? Yeah, Maxwell.
Hey, Jeremy, I know you can't see us, but thank you. That was so wonderful. One thing that I was wondering is whether you could comment a little bit on how the mental health assistant program might be understood in relation to other histories of radical study groups in jails and prisons. If this is like a different iteration of that in some sort, or if this is something different. I don't know. I imagine that you maybe have something to share on that.
Just a little, which is, I think, in some ways that we, you know, thinking with people like Orasami Burton and thinking of prisons as this kind of unfolding site of insurgency and counterinsurgency, so much of what's possible for incarcerated people is so limited by these histories of counterinsurgency. And so following the story of Cragen in particular, he was on death row for 12 years and learned from many of peers, through walls about the importance of study and the importance of reading and getting his education. And those mentors really helped him cultivate this consciousness of kind of constant, relentless self redefinition. and of kind of strategizing against a system that really he had a very in most stark terms was just kind of expecting him, stating to him, as he would say to me, that he has no value and that just waiting for him to die. And so against that, he really his journey to arrive at the mental health assistant program involved him constantly trying to change those expectations, trying to push against in any to find the contradictions within the system and to really push against them. And so what he did, for example, is when he was on death row, and then when his case was thrown out and he was brought down to the county jail system where it's now being tried currently. He argued, well, if I'm not found guilty, that means I don't need to be in this highest security status, and I should be treated like any other person awaiting trial, in which case I should have access to the very limited educational programming in the jail. And so it was him pushing that contradiction within the jail that let him get into the education unit. Then from the education unit, he took full advantage of it, then pushed to be able to become a merit master. Then he pushed the position of being a merit master to be a mental health assistant. And then from there, actually, they created a rare, unique space in the county jail system, because the LA County jail system is its own racial project. It's its own, racism is used as a labor or kind of a human management strategy. So the units in general population are all organized racially, which precludes a lot of the organizing and possibilities that were actually made possible on the mental health assistant, where you can see Cragen was categorized as African American, Black American. Adrian Bruman was categorized as Latino, and so they would never have had contact, and they often spoke about how they would never have been in touch, and this would their friendship and relationship would not have been possible. So I think following his path helps show how much uh, what he did was actually was the jail would have made it, the prison would have made it impossible were it not for his relentless kind of insurgency in not accepting expectations of his just idleness and slow death.
Hi, Jeremy. This is Blake. Very articulate, novel points made about a topic that's been studied by others, which is not an easy thing to do. I was just wondering, where are you going with this? Are you thinking a book? Are you thinking of like packaging this into certain articles? What kind of publications? I'm just interested to hear next steps. I see you have the activism going, but what else are you going to do with it?
Finishing residency.
Yeah. I can respond just that the psychiatric fix portion. I'm working through into a publication, and the idea is that it's a failed strategy. It's a failed solution institutionally, that it doesn't actually work. And then yeah, I think possibly a book, because it's such a long it's such a uh, uh, it's a it's such a remarkable story, and of course Craig and Adrian's accounts I think are the place to start. But I feel so I think that's probably what I'll go do next once yes, residency is done. But it's great to hear your voice, Blake, and I'm sorry I missed you this morning.
Any other questions for Jeremy? Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, Jeremy. This is Christian Yanez. I have a question regarding like I'm thinking about like programs like the mental health assistant program, and also more broadly like other kind of like reforms, like the introduction of like the tablets and like getting out these different like apps that are now available to a lot of people that are incarcerated. How would you situate them in the world of like thinking about them as reforms? Because I feel like there is an argument that can be made that they are kind of like this like depoliticizing tool, like reformist reform, in that like where are they going in a sense, but obviously they also kind of like in a lot of senses, like really critically improve the quality of life of people that are incarcerated. So how do you kind of think about that? How do your interlocutors like situate these like different technologies?
Yeah, great question, and one that I've wrestled with in moments, and Philippe and I have wrestled in moments when we've applied for grants. That's Philippe can talk about that. But I think the um, actually I found a lot of clarity in my conversations with Robin Kelly, who I think in some ways schooled me, and but helped me kind of better think through when we think about reform and reformist reform and non-reformist reform that kind of has been brought into more circulation from with Ruthie's work, and that we have to be dialectical, that we that we have to be dialectical and historical in a sense. And so when we think about and I think one of the things I was trying to emphasize here is that actually if you look at this program without understanding who and what and where it's coming from, and if you without understanding the history and the contradictions that were actually seized, and then all the new possibilities and openings that are coming from it, and you only look at it from the outside, you can see, oh, this is just a reformist reform. But that's really missing so much, and it's missing so much on the ground. But it's also missing how actually we could be learning from the people that are um, kind of experiencing, living, and having the insight, the genius, the bravery to identify and organize against the contradictions in real time to create new openings that, yes, of course, get co-opted. And yes, of course, will be kind of made to be then the next generations or the next moment's nightmare, but to really situate them and learn where they came from. I think with things like tablets and things, again, it's technologies are multiple. So I think it's worth us asking. I mean, I think there is a lot to be said for the degree to which the goal is to produce idleness, to produce is I mean, I think Orasanmi sometimes speaks literally, and sometimes I think there's a way we could take it more generally to think about the kind of mind control that is enacted in that. But I think the point being that if there is a kind of um, intellectual deconditioning, a discouragement of any kind of consciousness building, such that people can, and yet it will still happen. It will fail, and people will still find each other and organize. There's a beautiful line that Craig had said to me, saying, the mental health assistant program as he imagines it, it will never die, and it will just continue, because really what it's about is people coming together, organizing, supporting one another, and fighting against a system that devalues and is trying to annihilate them. So I don't know if that's an answer, but I would love to talk about it more, Christian, if I hopefully see you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. Really powerful